It's worth saying as well, by the way, that what we're doing here is just a microcosm of what is happening all the way through this conference. At every meal table, at every coffee point, at every moment. Actually, what we're doing is simply what you've already been doing and surely must continue to do as you chat to friends, as you tell them about situations in church, and you say, well, how do you think I might deal with that? And someone says, well, you could have think of this or you could do that. But those kind of discussions are happening all the time. We're simply modelling it in a slightly more public way. So let me start off, and I'll start with you, Tom, because you're right on the end. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, a tiny bit of kind of background, and then a little bit more about the churches that you've been in and your kind of leadership experience, if you will.
My name's Tom. Tom Fenning. I serve as pastor of Beccles Baptist Church, now married to Emily with 3 boys.
Just tell us where Beccles is.
Beccles is really near Hemsby. It's not without a glorious dose of irony that I became pastor at Beccles in March, which is 40 minutes away from Hemsby.
So you moved to Beccles in order to be near Hemsby, is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
although it's my fault because I was at the leaders' conference last year and I knew it was coming here. But I did, have to get up at 6:15. No, we left at 6:15 yesterday morning to be here. So there we go. I think a few of us are planning on going back to Hemsby and having some sort of memorial service on Ground Zero.
Well, you could go and have Christmas. There's Christmas decorations are probably up, so you probably could go and have a Christmas dinner there.
So Beccles Baptist Church, which at the moment is not in the FIEC, we're talking at the moment as a church family about potentially joining. It's a Grace Baptist church, but as I say to everyone, the thing you need to know about our church is that we have drums and they are played. So it's a Grace Baptist, so more conservative, but we have drums, okay? So really it looks very much like an FIEC church. 3 boys, Emily and I, the eldest of whom is 6.5, the youngest is 3, and they're crazy and lots of fun. Church experience, I have served on the staff of 3 churches. They get progressively smaller, the largest of which was a church called Jesmond Parish Church up in Newcastle upon Tyne, a large Anglican church. When I served there both as an apprentice and then as a student worker, it had a staff team of about 36, serving a church of around 1,100. It was a really big church, a church we loved, and a church that God used greatly in training me. Then I was on staff with Mark Lawrence at Christchurch Dunstable until the turn of the year, had a brilliant time there. If you were in his seminar today, which I wasn't, but I'm pretty sure I knew what he said, you can see that I've been richly blessed by learning from him.
He spoke about you all the time. Yeah.
Thank you, Adrian. Christchurch Dunstable had a membership just shy of 300. There's a pastoral team of 4 of us, 3 of whom preached, a staff team of both full and part-time of about a dozen, and just, great place to serve, great place to learn. And now Beccles Baptist Church, membership of just over 70, congregation on a Sunday of just over 100, and a great place to be, a church that's made us feel really welcome, and there's much work for us to do there. But that's our church experience today.
And just tell us, are you there in terms of leadership? What does leadership look like there?
So I serve as the pastor. I'm ably assisted by 2 elders, one of whom is also a pastoral assistant, who serves alongside me about 3 days a week. Or he says, when do I stop being an employee and when do I start being an elder? So he's largely full-time, really, out of his goodness, and serves alongside me. There's also a youth worker who serves on staff for 2 and a bit days a week and works brilliantly. And then a team of deacons alongside us.
Thanks very much, Tom. Ray, over to you.
Name's Ray Evans. I'm from Bedford. I've lived in Bedford nearly 40 years. I've been in church leadership there for over 35. Church started in 1972 with just a dozen people. We came and it was about 80. We've been involved in 4 or 5 church plants, and now the church where I serve with the leadership team is about 500 people. And it's been a real privilege to be there. So I've been in one church a very long time. And in that church, growing through different size bands, if you like. I mean, it's gone from a sort of smallish to a medium to an awkward to now a small, large church. And that's quite a privilege to have gone through that experience, learning along the way the different pressures that those things bring, the different opportunities that brings too. Married to Jenny, we have 4 children, 3 are married, we have 7 grandchildren. They are 6, 5, 4, 3, 2 18-month-year-old and 1 6-month-year-old. And they all live locally, so it's great, real privilege.
Okay. And just when you went there and it was 80 people, what did leadership in the church look like at that stage?
Okay, so the previous pastor, the founding pastor, Colin Richards, was a brilliant preacher and had a real passion for church planting and evangelism way before it was, in any sense, fashionable. So breaking new ground in the mid-1970s. And so my first elders meeting, the first thing he told me was, never think the church has got so bad, Ray, that it can't get worse under your leadership. Lesson number one. And lesson number two, we are going to plant a new church in about 3 months' time, and I'm leaving you. That was almost, welcome to the job. So it was a bit sink or swim. And if you're a preacher, you'll know how horrible this is. A really, really brilliant preacher plants a church 1.5 miles down the road. I'm thinking, this can only go badly wrong. And in the goodness of God, it didn't. And but so a lot of hard lessons early on. So it was a real passion to reach lost people, and we'll do whatever it takes, even if it means throwing you in at the deep end. Oh, you can swim. Oh, that was a good idea after all.
Great, thank you, Ray. And Ray has written a book on leadership, by the way, which is along in the bookstore. It's called Ready, Steady, Grow, and you can go and find a copy of that. Michael, a very important question that's come in. How do you pronounce Michael's surname?
Very good question, actually. It's Deutsch with a T, so it's very German in origin. Though I'm anything but German, I'm utterly
you're from
American.
Wales. I can clearly tell that by the
tell
accent.
that, can't you?
Yeah.
No, I'm a lost Coloradan Yankee in the UK. Came over about 34 years ago. Somehow or another, they never caught up with my visa, and they let me stay. So I've been here for about the last 34 years.
And tell us where you've been, Michael. Well, tell us a bit about family first.
Okay, family, Davina, she's British, from Wiltshire, and we've had 4 children. They're all grown up now. The oldest is 30, youngest 25, up and down the M1. Initially, I came over in our seminary. I went to a church of about 60 people. Didn't really know where it was going. I had the joy of serving there for about 12 years. Then I was called up to Flitwick and joined the Bedford Mafia. Real joy being there, about 19 years, fellowship.
What sort of size was it when you went, Michael? Was it a rough idea?
I'm not really one to catch on numbers too closely, but I think it was somewhere around about 100, maybe 105 members, and it grew to about 130 while I was there. I think about 200 or so, sort of a large, medium-ish church during my time there. And then just recently, I've been asked to go and join the team at Highfields in Cardiff. So I've gone from different to Tom. I've gone up, and Highfields, I think, has somewhere around 800 on Sunday. Staff team about 15.
Great. Thank you very much. My experience is spent 10 years in pastoring a small town church, I guess, large village church in Yateley in Hampshire. 35 members, 40 members, that kind of size, grew to about 60 members, congregation of about 70, 75, 80, in quite an isolated little town, not quite rural, but I'm stuck at the top end of Hampshire, not really commuter belt, not really anything really, but just a place where the Lord had me for 10 years. And then when I worked for the Proclamation Trust, which I did until recently, I was associate pastor alongside Ken Brownell, who's somewhere, there he is, Ken, hello Ken, at East London Tabernacle in Mile End, a completely different kind of church with a Russian-speaking congregation, multinational, 60 nationalities plus, something like that, ministering in the Mile End. And then I've just moved to Harborough and joined the Leader Light Church that is Christchurch Market, Harborough. We have several people who've come from the office who are in leadership there. This is a very important question. This is the kind of level that we're getting from on the floor. Where did Tom get his shirt from? I'm a bit disappointed no one asked me where my shirt came from, because I think my shirt is a bit more spectacular.
You're hiding your shirts.
Yeah, that's what it is.
You have a special taste in
Thank you.
shirts, Adrian.
Let's move on to something slightly more important. Let's Let's just think about leadership. You've got different experiences of leadership. I'd love to hear from each of you, just to kind of get us going, and this might stimulate some questions and input as well from the floor. What is it something that has made a step change in how you view leadership? I mean, obviously, especially, Michael, I guess for you and Ray, you've had lots of probably step changes along the way. But can you pick out one thing for us which has made a real step change, a significant change in terms of how you view and think about leadership? Michael, why don't we kick off with you?
I think probably one of the things that most caused me to step back and ask myself questions was just literally being exposed to good leaders. And I think it's very easy in a small church or a medium church to isolate yourself if you're not careful. And there are always endless things you can do. But I have found myself personally the value of pushing myself to get alongside people who have experience. I had the privilege of being involved in the FIEC Council, and I immensely grew just from watching other men of real maturity and wisdom.
So when you say watching, what does that mean, watching?
I'd watch and see, first of all, how they would answer questions. I learned very quickly that I was very poor at answering questions. But I listened to how they answered questions. I listened to how they actually looked at issues. What were the priorities? How would the questions they would ask to try to solve a problem? And I think as I thought through that, it caused me to go start reading, thinking about things. And that forced me to move out of just reacting to ministry, but actually to strategically thinking about where do I want to go in ministry.
Okay. Now that's interesting, because you essentially learned that by osmosis then.
Yeah.
By kind of hanging out with and being with people who did that better than you did. So Tom, just let's pick up on that as a theme for a minute. Is that kind of how you learned at Dunstable, or was it a more structured program? How much of that was structured? How much of it was kind of just hanging out with people like Mark?
A massive degree of what God has taught me has been through just rubbing shoulders with other able, godly people. Very much so, Mark. One of the real delights with Mark is that he would just always have his door open, and he never was unavailable. He just always was there, always would respond to assist and help if there were questions, but also would involve you in everything that's going on. So there's very little of what's going on in church life, decisions he was making, that he would hide the process of what he was thinking. And that comes with Mark being a lot of stuff he does by instinct rather than by kind of sitting down with a piece of paper. He's a kind of gut feel, but he would show you what's going on. And that was just undoubtedly the chief thing that God has used to train and equip me. And I think back to other people like, I was privileged to work with a guy called Ian Garrett at Jesmond Parish Church as well, and just observing him function, again, with a study door that was always open, always willing to talk. Those sort of lessons, just absolutely enormous. And I think that puts an onus on me, having recently arrived in Beccles and thinking, okay, who are you training up now, Tom? Who are the people you're looking to influence and encourage and equip?
And are you still looking for people to hang out with that you can learn from then?
Yeah, I think very much so. I think it's with a kind of network of people that I know. I often will try and tap into talking with people at conferences like this. I'll come with particular people I'd like to talk to and ask questions of. Very often, if we're thinking about implementing something, if in the future implementing something at Beccles, if I know that someone else has travelled that journey already or thought that process through, I will invariably talk with them and try and mine them for all the information that they've got, try and learn from any mistakes they've made and try and avoid making them and other ones that I could make. So I think that networking, that relationships with other people is just critical.
Okay. Ray, that kind of relational learning, what happens when you're the only guy? So, you're on your own. Yeah. And maybe you feel a little bit isolated. Is that still possible to create that atmosphere, that environment where you can learn in that way?
Yeah, I think one of the key lessons of being a good leader is you become a reflective practitioner.
Tell us what that means.
So I had it really helped by a friend who was a doctor, and so we learn as we think about what we do. We don't just keep doing the same old thing, getting nowhere. We have to think. And he said, Ray, you need to do the same in your job. You have to reflect on what you're doing. And part of that is then, looking to other people who can, as you reflect and go, do you know what, I do this not very well, or I feel nervous about that, or I don't see myself as being really serving God effectively here. as I see the areas I need to improve on, where am I going to get help from? And again, doctors look to other doctors. Could you advise me? That very rarely in a one surgery have you got all the expertise you need. So you have to learn to look out. You have to know what journals to read, who to talk to. You build up a network. And that's where I think something like a leaders' conference is brilliant, because so much of what you're doing outside of a session like this is you are beginning to build up a network of people who you go, look, I know you've gone through this problem. Could you give me a bit of advice? That's how GPs learn. There are tremendous resources available to us now, blogs, articles, books. There are people you can contact through email that you could never have easily got hold of in the past. So I think that reflecting on your own practice, if you like, and then, thinking, who could I ask? And they might know somebody that could help me with this problem. So you don't have to feel isolated. You don't have to lock yourself away in a study. You can, even if you're an introvert, I'm a classic introvert, as many guys in ministry are. You can still begin to ask advice, and people are willing to help one another, because that's the aim. It's not, I got it right, learn from me. It's like, I'm still figuring this out, but if this helps you a little bit, and in a place like this and flowing from this, that's invaluable.
So you can do it if you're an introvert.
Yeah.
You can't do it if you're proud, though, can you? That would be a barrier, and
yeah. Well, I think
can be a besetting sin for pastors.
You have to see. I'm a lifelong learner. I think I conned myself till I was about 55 that I was still a young pastor, still learning. All I am now is I'm just
last year.
I'm still an older pastor, still learning. But it's that lifelong learning thing. Okay. So I had a friend of mine recently. He just finished a research degree, and I said, what did you learn? And I was hoping for the answer, and the answer he gave, which is the one I was hoping for, I learned that I don't know much at all. You know, that's what a PhD teaches you. You don't know much at all. So what are you going to do then? Right, I need to be a lifelong learner. And we can learn leadership, not big L, big ego leadership, but that learning to serve more effectively if I'm willing to keep learning the whole of my life.
Well, Michael, what about you as a more senior guy? I don't mean senior in years, a senior pastor. You know, how do you make sure that you keep learning and keep growing? What steps have you taken to make sure you do that?
I think one of the things that I had to learn very easily is that if I was going to keep growing, it was all down to me. And I think that's sometimes important, because sometimes we can actually believe in ministry that it will just happen, or that others are going to come along and give me the answers. The thing I found is I go away, I listen, I hear questions, people mention books. I'll go away and I'll say, I need to get that book. And I'll force myself to read through books that, to be frankly, sometimes I find deadly boring. But I'll force myself to do it.
Not Ray's book.
I'd rather not answer that. No, Ray's book was very helpful.
He'll break your legs.
Exactly. He had men. But I think the thing is that I just learned very quickly, I think it was Ministry Dick Lucas and others, that I have to be a self-starter. I have to set myself goals. If I'm going to continue in ministry, and the only way you can continue in ministry is to grow personally, so that you're constantly growing, that I had to make that a priority in my own diary. And so it was, for me, it was talking with people, being alongside, calling up Ray sometimes, hey, can we have a cup of coffee, things like that. But being proactive to grow, I think, is what I found.
Yeah, that's, I mean, riffing off what the BT was saying earlier on today, that whole thing with you've got to control your diary. And I just think it's that making time, ring-fencing time to think is just enormously helpful. And I finished my degree at Oak Hill part-time. My third year I did part-time, and I did a dissertation as my last module that I did. And I just did some thinking on leadership in there, and I was so grateful for the lesson that taught me, not only the stuff I learnt in thinking through leadership in that dissertation, but actually just that going, you've got to dedicate time to this stuff to be able to think it through, and actually ring-fencing time to do that is critical. And I think in the busyness of me arriving recently in Beccles. I don't think I'm very good at that at the moment, but I'm aware that I need to be much better at that if I'm going to be, as Michael said, a self-starter and actually going to learn and progress as a leader.
Okay. Ray, how about you? Something that's made a significant change in thinking about leadership in the church?
Yeah, I think when I started out, as I told you, as a brilliant preacher a mile and a half down the road, so I thought, right, I better work on my preaching. I've got to learn to handle God's word more better than I was. And then you get to sort of early 30s and realize that your simplistic answers to people's problems, I better deepen my understanding of people. End of my 30s thinking, okay, I'm a pastor teacher. I'm not very good at either, but at least it was quite scary waking up to this whole thing of leadership. So early 40s, waking up to that. And suspicious of it. Some of the things I've come across about leadership seem to be just very big personas. And thinking, I'm not sure, am I importing something alien into the life of the church? Certainly not my character. But beginning to understand that actually there's a component to taking a church forward to the next level that is about leadership. And two things helped me. One was recognizing the issue, again, it's been put our finger on it today, by our example, by our enthusiasm, by our passion, by our faith, we generate that, we help generate that amongst others. So it's not just what I say, it's how I live. So New Testament qualifications of leadership are all about character, and recognizing that in one sense, if I didn't live the life, who is going to follow? That was one. So I recognized that became ever more important to me. The second thing was really Acts 6 became a hugely helpful passage to me, understanding here was a leadership team in action, analyzing a problem, not mistakenly diagnosing the problem, helping the church, coming up with a good plan, that there was an element to my job that I had not been trained for. I wasn't that analytical, but recognizing there was a problem here in Acts 6, they understood what the problem was, feeding widows, but short of resources, time under pressure, church is growing, everybody's moaning, and yet they led that church through it. But they didn't just preach at it, they didn't just pray at it, they came up with a workable plan, and that is a job I've got to do. So beginning to learn in my early 40s, Acts 6 was extremely helpful. It released me to say there are parts of my job that God requires me to do. It's about leadership, but it's not about big ego leadership. So those two things together, one was the sort of enthusiastic faith and passion leadership, and the other was, let's understand what the problem is, and maybe together we can solve it and go through this. We do not have Hebraic-speaking and Greek-speaking widows that we've got to feed, but what are our equivalents? And for me, that was very helpful time. So began to pick up from others, when you face this building problem or when you face this financial challenge, how did you get through it? So that, for me, was a very formative time. As it were, added a dimension to my leading of the church that had probably been absent.
When you start talking about words like delegation, that they're words often that are in a kind of secular business model of leadership. There's quite a few questions coming through about is there a danger in embracing a worldly view of leadership or learning from the world? How do we manage to learn from the wisdom that is in the world without embracing worldliness, I guess is the kind of root question. Any of you guys got any wisdom on that?
Well, I think God's truth is spread throughout the world, and there is common grace. And so I think that one would need to recognize that truth is truth, whether it's found within the context of the church or whether it's outside the church. I think probably the biggest single factor, it's interesting even seeing modern theories of leadership, how remarkably Christian they are moving.
Yeah.
So when they talk about type 5 leaders, actually they talk about a very humble person. So, and even the world around us is actually recognizing Christian values when it comes to leadership itself. But I suppose the biggest issue is we filter all truth through our understanding of the scriptures. And we must filter the leadership of the world and what we might learn from the world. We need to filter that through our understanding of Scripture. We need to filter all truth we hear within the Christian church through the filter of our understanding. So I'm not sure that simply because someone calls themselves a Christian and they say they can speak on leadership, that I would necessarily believe their leadership motto is actually very biblical. So I think there is the work we have to do with all wisdom that we look at and to filter that through.
That's helpful. So actually the root issue is not worldliness per se. The root issue is lacking spiritual discernment on our part to be able to look at things, whether they're inside the church or outside the church, say, yes, that's rooted in the gospel, no, that's not, and be able to distinguish between the two.
Yeah, and
I think one other thing, which I just think, which sometimes we have to recognize is, it is often the case within the Christian world and Christian church, we don't give leadership the value that it should have in our community.
How do you mean? Go on to say a bit more about that.
Primarily, we think, in a smaller situation, that we think if we just are doing the main things in ministry, that's all that's required. And yet, we don't recognize that actually sometimes we do need to organize things. We need to do things better, in a wiser way. We need to actually focus with intentionality on doing the right things rather than the immediate things. And I think that's one thing that perhaps the world teaches us, because in the end of the day, your company goes bankrupt if you don't do the right things. So I think there are lessons they can teach us to actually do our job better.
Okay, sure. Tom, you're going to say something?
I think trying to discern whether the wisdom that the world has in things regarding leadership are helpful, community, and actually having fellow leaders who you can say, I've been reading this book by such and such. I think they're really onto something with this, but I don't want to misread that. What do you think? These are the points where I'm concerned most. Anything else you can spot in that?
So Ray and I have been reading a book like that recently, where it's exactly that. It's a worldly book, and you're going to look at it and you think, well, is there something in this that looks like there's something in this? And being able to discern what is good and what isn't.
Yeah, and that's where having good, sane people who you can count as counsellors and confidants is just critical at every turn. So it's back to that kind of what's taught you most is the people you've observed and you've caught leadership from. Those people are then brilliant safety nets to make sure that you don't get embroiled with or sucked into a worldly or an undiscerning way of thinking, because often my blind spots I can't see, and I need someone else to say, "Oh, Tom, you've not looked at it like that." Okay, there's a bigger note of caution there than I had thought.
Right.
Can I just add, we can say that, but I think there's a passage of the Bible that teaches this.
Go on.
And it's Exodus 18, when just before the giving of the law, where God prescribes so much. The colour of the pomegranates on the high priest's robe, God says, I want it purple and blue. That's the colour I want. But the very passage before that is an outsider, Jethro, a priest of Midian, not quite sure what that means, but he's not a covenant member. He comes in, he sees the people of God in a mess, he sees his own son-in-law stressed out and struggling. There is a deep sense of awe of God. He wants the people of God to be blessed, so he's not a complete out-and-out pagan, but he's not an Israelite. And he comes up with a solution to the problem that says, Moses, you need leaders of tens and leaders of 50s and leaders of hundreds, leaders of thousands. He comes up with an organizational solution that Moses listens to and puts into practice, and the people of God are cared for properly. Moses gets his life back, and Jethro disappears. So he kind of appears, gives some wisdom, and disappears. And it's almost as if the Lord is saying, I am going to tell you a lot, but there are some things that I am prescribing wisdom. There's not, this answer won't fit every situation, but there is wisdom out there, listen to it. It's almost as if he brings an out. God could have said, Moses, I'm telling you, I want them around tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. But God says, no, I want an outside voice to give you some wisdom and have the discernment to know what is wise and what is not wise. And there's that passage that, now, we are not told we have to do it that way, but what we're shown there is that there is wisdom from outside, and we have to have that discernment. So it's not just us saying that. I think there's a good biblical argument for that.
And the language of leadership is very strong in the New Testament too, isn't it? So you've got I think probably the gift of administration, that's probably what that is, kybernesis, is piloting the ship, isn't it? It's not just doing the photocopying. There's a sense in which you're giving direction, you're managing the whole thing, being able to manage the household well in 1 Timothy 3. That language still comes through very strongly, isn't it? Okay. So, someone, by the way, has just texted in, what does salus et felicitas mean, which is up there on the crest. So that's not anything to do with leadership. But it would be the motto of Joel Osteen's church, if he ever planted in Oxford, I guess. Truth and happiness. No, health and happiness, isn't that right? Health. Who does Latin? Ken, you know things like this. Health and happiness, is that right? Ken says yes. Health and happiness. Good. We're talking at quite a high level at the moment. It's sort of quite a philosophical level about leadership. Let's just get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about elderships. Because actually we believe in plural leaderships in our churches. Very often the pastor or the senior pastor has more time to pray and consider, and so naturally takes a lead amongst elders. Nevertheless, we've got a plurality of eldership. And actually, if we're going to take a church to another level, if we're going to transform church, we need to be not just thinking about leadership for ourselves, but we need to be thinking about how we encourage other leaders and work with other leaders in the churches, don't we, where we are. So just tell us, Ray, a little bit in terms of your experience, how you've worked with a leadership. What are maybe 1 or 2 highlights of things that have gone well? What are 1 or 2 things that have not gone well that you've learned from in terms of thinking about a leadership team?
Yeah. So on the not well side...
Is it easier to come up with those things?
Yeah, straight away. This is like, I'm a typical, like we were saying earlier, the Brit thing, the negative comes first. I think for a lot of time, we had a tiny eldership. So we, in effect, had to use the diaconate as an accountability group, a thing where we learn from one another. For many, many years, there was just 2 of us in eldership. Then we were able to hire somebody to become another elder, but he, after 2 years, found the job too lonely. He'd come from a busy ambulance control room where, 99 calls all the time and there was lots of things happening, and he was finding 5-6 hours of his working day on his own. He found it very difficult, and it seemed to set us back. And I didn't understand calling somebody into church leadership. In a smallest church, there isn't a big staff. There isn't an office. You're on your own a lot of the time. You're visiting people. Nobody's going to ask you much. How did it go? How can I look after you? And I think I didn't understand how important that was. Tried to use the diaconate to help do that, but we didn't get that right for many a long year. Then, as we've grown our team, we confused. All elders are sort of equal in authority. I don't think there's Personally, I don't think there is the senior minister who has authority over everybody else. But then we had to understand that functionally, to get our jobs done, who's going to be my line manager? Who's going to ask me how my job's going? Who's going to hold me to account? So we had to work that one out. I think that's worked quite well in that we understood that though we are colleagues together, I have to have a conversation. It's a one-way conversation saying, how's your job going? What's gone well? What's not gone well this month? How have you solved it so far? How can I help you? What are you planning to do in the future? So that we don't duplicate all the time. So this last 4 or 5 years, we've tried to operate. I meet with 3 other staff elders individually. Once a month, I meet with them together every week. And somebody does that to me. Somebody says, Ray, how's your job doing? Are you doing the job we're paying you for? I think that's gone quite well. So we haven't got a hierarchy. There's no kind of badge of rank, but functionally we said, Ray, you ask Martin and Simon and John how their job's going, and Nick, Rich and David will ask you how your job's going, so that we keep each other focused about our work.
How do you create a culture where you're able to divvy that stuff up, so to speak, and still retain common ownership? Is that possible?
Lots of discussion, lots of talking together. Trying to play to one another's strengths. Adrian and I were reading a book recently. It was a very helpful book. In the past, you may have come across a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We've used those a lot, but they're a difficult tool because you always end up with threats. So you're always playing to the negative. The last thing you've got in your mind is the danger. So you end up being. Whereas we were discussing this one of strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results, this kind of SOAR, which is a much more positive. We started using that, and that's been a more helpful. So together we just say, what are our strengths? What are your strengths, my strengths? We had one recently. We did this very strange, we got 4 of us in the room like this, said, right, hour of silence, write down what you think your strengths are, what your opportunities for the future are going to be, what your dreams are. You write that down for yourself. Then you write down what you think my strengths are, you know, and what I think you... And we did that for each other, and we're going to read it all out to one another. And it was like really scary, because you think, I wonder what they think of me. And can I write that about them? But we had it was a great way forward. So if we spent an hour writing about each other, strengths, opportunities, aspirations, results. And it just helped us understand, there was a lot of commonality. So that ability to have an honest conversation, to have a bit of creative tension, an eldership that's all bland it's not going to go forward. You've got to have that, I don't agree with that, or I'm not sure you're very good at that, Ray, or learning from one another like that.
Do you end up then making collective decisions?
Yeah, we do.
That even if someone doesn't agree with it, they kind of buy in and say, okay.
Yeah, there's a sort of that Chatham House. Like once we've discussed it, we've all had a say. I have the privilege of being chair. So the chair of a discussion, in one sense, has less power because you can't keep on putting in, but you do summarize at the end. You have to learn to do, that's how you have to learn to work together.
And no one's allowed to say in 3 months, I told you so.
Oh, well, maybe.
Tom, you've got just 2 elders working
right.
alongside you.
Yeah.
So how's that dynamic beginning to work in terms of just sharing responsibility and thinking about how do we take the church onto the next level?
I think, the 2 elders, Doug, who works part-time on the staff, the other elder is a man called John, who has terminal cancer and is having chemotherapy at the moment, and he is able to do less than he was. He was doing absolutely heaps, and actually he was the employed elder, and then he and Doug swapped because of his ill health. So how does it work at the moment? John is able to contribute loads in our meetings and does some bits and pieces administratively behind the scenes, and then Doug and I are doing more kind of visiting of people and overseeing a pastoral team. But I think the thing that is very much on my plate at the moment is thinking forward and looking at the church and thinking who are the people who, God willing, might be raised up to come and work alongside us. I have not rushed to make that decision because I could have invited people. The danger is you invite someone in to be trained up who could be not so helpful or you just don't click with. And so I think that in the new year I'm hoping to have a little pool of people, half a dozen people maybe, who I meet with to try and train up to then serve as elders, to strengthen the current eldership that's there. And at the moment, I think one of the things that I learned from working alongside Mark is that you've got to work really hard to make sure that your leaders are in the loop of what you're planning to do. And actually,
what do you actually mean by that?
So, as in that you can make decisions and you can tell a few people, but then there's almost invariably some people who are missed out in kind of a new venture you're going to do. So we recently launched a new home group. The danger in that is that I could have done that, but actually all but one of my deacons could have been in the dark, or only I told one of the elders. When I was at JPC, the vicar there, a guy called David Holloway, used to use this adage time and again. He used to say, we constantly underestimate what people can do and overestimate what people know. We overestimate what people know, and I think that's really helpful in just thinking actually to utilise your elders and your leaders in the church. You've got to work really hard so that they know what is happening until it feels like you've told everyone 10 times. It almost feels like that, so that they're then empowered to assist you and help you. And actually that work of constantly telling people, this is what we're going to do, this is where we're going to go, is really key. And actually striving to do that with my elders, with my deacons, is something I'm trying to work constantly at. I don't do it flawlessly, but actually to empower them to serve and for me to really feel like they are able to assist me as much as possible, I've got to work really hard at that.
Okay. Michael, I'm going to ask you a question. It would require a bit of explaining, so it'll give you a chance to think of an answer. Just thinking about working with different groups of people, you can go first and pick which one you want, really, so you've got the pick of the bunch. Thinking about volunteers, working with volunteers, a lot of leadership is about leading volunteers. It's not about leading paid employees. except in a very small number of very unusual churches. So what are some of the pressures and some of the challenges in terms of leading volunteers, A? What are some of the pressures and challenges in leading reluctant people who aren't quite with you? You know, the deacons who kind of want to be a bit more in leadership than they are, perhaps, or people who want to go in a different direction. Third group of people, how do we integrate well, being complementarians, how do we integrate well women into leadership roles within the church in an appropriate way? So, Michael, you've got first dibs, really. You can choose whichever one of those you want.
I'm going to take the first. That's a lot easier.
Okay.
I really love what our brother said this morning about one of the goals of ministry, and I take this from Ephesians 4. One of the goals of those in ministry is not to do the ministry, but to empower other people and the members to be trained up to do the ministry. And I think that's a very crucial thing to do within the whole fellowship, and I would see within the whole working with volunteers. The very first thing I want to do is to say, throw out rotors. Rotors are impersonal. You do a rotor, when you get a rotor, you see your name down there, and you just go, oh, okay, I got to do that. What I want to do is move people beyond a rotor to actually see that as their unique way to display God's glory in their life. So I want to invest a lot of time into my volunteers, actually helping them to see they're unique. They've been raised up, placed within this fellowship with unique set of gifts, personality, experiences, and that they can be empowered in a voluntary way to get on with that ministry. And to
that sounds great. What does that actually mean? Just kind of drill down for us a bit. So I'm in your church, I've just arrived, say, hey, I'm here, I can play the piano, right? I can play the piano. What are you going to do what would you actually do to invest that kind of attitude in me?
I think the very first thing you have to do is you make a step back from that. And the first thing is it has to be your conviction. Okay, I think a lot of people will say that, yes, I know that, but it's not their conviction in how to actually operate church. Okay. So I think it has to be your own personal conviction. I think you have to, in the appropriate ways, bring that out in your preaching. Because in many ways, your congregation is going to determine what is your stance on things, through how you apply things, what you say, the throwaway lines when you're up front, to actually say to them, this is my calling, or what I believe is for you, is I want to help you to be what God wants you to be. Then I think various ways of training. I think that you have to actually set aside the priority to equip the people, teach them that is their calling. Everyone does have an actual role to play. And then it's going to then take stepping back at that point, sitting down with them, working through with them their personality, their strengths, their experience, their skill sets, and say, what about trying this?
So training is not primarily functional in that model. It's spiritual first, right? And then the function follows afterwards. So at some point, you've got to show them how to move the faders on the PA.
Absolutely.
But that's down the line.
That's down the line.
Actually, before that comes this kind of spiritual ethos about what serving in the church is and how they can serve in a way that glorifies God and can benefit the church and all that kind of stuff.
That's what I would say, because if you don't catch their heart, then what you're going to have is somebody who's doing it for a while, and then they say, well, I don't want to do this anymore, and they leave. But if you can catch their heart, empower a team, get them really focused upon the fact that this is their way to serve God, then it almost becomes self-propagating in that sense, and then they draw in others in that respect.
So, in fact, you can answer another question, because in a way, that's one of the ways to head off what you do with difficult people. Actually, because you're not taking people on in church roles simply because they can do it, but because they share the heart. Therefore, you're less likely, aren't you, to have those difficult issues down the line where someone says, well, I know how to operate the PA, but I'm not willing to do it because I don't agree with what you're doing here and what you're doing there.
I think that's helpful if you say you're less likely, because it's always going to happen, whatever. But sometimes the difficult people, you put them in the right place, they flourish.
Give us an example. Don't mention names, but just a kind
of thing.
I think,
let's, for instance, say people that are techie and very OCD. They love all the detail, but you put them in a position where they can just flourish in that, and they love it. I think you have to learn personally how to deal with people and different personalities. And I think in my own experience, that's probably one of the places I've most failed, is not always recognizing that I have to spend the first 5 minutes assessing what kind of personality is this? How do I talk to them? How do I interact with them? Because they'll hear what I say differently than another person. Okay. So I think you have to assess that, but put them in the right place and they flourish.
It's interesting then, that starts with a self-reflection that you're talking about, Ray, that actually it's not necessarily about, we reduce all of these things, don't we, then to problems with other people. With volunteers, the problem is with the volunteers, or with difficult people, the problem is with the difficult people. But you're hinting there that actually we've got to start thinking about ourselves in leadership first, and that self-reflection. How do I deal with people? How do I spot what kind of people they are, and that kind of stuff? Is that right?
Yeah, Tom, the study that Tom did, which was fantastic, because I nabbed it off him, was on emotional intelligence. And Tom, why don't you talk about that? Because what you learn in that study of understanding yourself, managing yourself, understanding others, managing others, actually, it's crucial, isn't it, when you're coming to deal with people? Because the one thing you can't do with volunteers, if you want to keep them, is tell them off too often. I mean, you lose them straight away. Yeah. Somebody once said to me, how do you train a killer whale? And the answer is carefully, because they will bite your head off. Well, volunteers will do the same. If you say, you're not very good at this, they'll go, okay, you do it. Bye, Ray. You just lost the whole of the sound team, in one go. So, Tom, you did a lot of work on this. This is really helpful, wasn't it? Can people get it off you? If they email you, they could get it, couldn't they? It would be really... It's terrific, wasn't it?
You could get it off me. You could, so the person who has written the most on this secularly is a man called Dan Goleman. If you want to put the book...
Did you say Goldman?
Goleman, Goleman.
Okay.
The most helpful book of his that I've read is called Working with Emotional Intelligence. And the thing that he challenges the world to think about is actually... The world has had a very narrow understanding of what intelligence is, so that we define it by IQ. Intelligence quotient. And he says, actually, if you look at the people who really flourish in life, often people can have an exceptional IQ, but that doesn't correspond to really getting on in life. And he says, actually, the ability to have intelligence in an emotional fashion, I'll explain that, what that means a bit more. Actually, that's a better barometer in working out whether people are going to actually make headway in life, are going to flourish in life. And so he talks about people who earn the most money, but also just people who are happy. So he defines emotional intelligence reasonably simply as basically being able to understand emotions in yourself and then manage emotions in yourself. So just being able to interpret that I feel like getting cross at the moment, or I'm anxious. But then also understanding that causes me to react like this. So understanding, then managing. Okay, I'm getting anxious. I need to calm down, and having good ways in which we can manage that. But then emotional intelligence has a social dimension, a personal dimension, and then a social dimension. And the social dimension works in exactly the same way. It's about being able to understand the emotional read of someone else. So someone else is really happy. Someone else is seething and trying to hide it. Or actually the room is excited. And actually being able to interpret what's happening, but then being able to manage those emotions in a helpful way. And so Goleman uses loads of examples, but I think of one where he talks about a BBC executive who has to go in and tell a whole department that they're being laid off. And he goes into the room, this executive, and he basically talks to them. He starts talking about how actually they've entered journalism not to make lots of money, but actually in order to help people learn about truth and actually to see unheard voices be heard. And he buys them over, and then he says, and I'm really sorry, but the bad news is that you're having to be laid off. But actually, remember, that's not why you went in. You didn't go into journalism to make lots of money. And actually, that passion's going to remain. And he was delivering dreadful news, but it was received really well because he tapped into the audience and actually helped say, I understand what you're feeling, and I feel it too. And I think often what we need to do as leaders a lot of the time is be able to help understand how people are feeling emotionally and to lead them helpfully emotionally. Now, that can sound really Machiavellian, pretty creepy, but Goleman doesn't have the backing that we have from Scripture to keep us on the straight and narrow in that, but he is very virtuous in how he talks about it. He says that don't try and just be Machiavellian in how you use this to manipulate people. He says you're to use it virtuously and rightly, but actually that trying to help lead people emotionally and helpfully is really key. And I think it's one of those worldly wisdom things that as I studied it helped lots of lights go on for me of just thinking, actually being able to help gauge emotionally where people are at and help lead them emotionally is really helpful. And so whether that is the person who's too excited about any change at church, or it's the person who's a malcontent and try and help them change. It just gave a kind of diagnostic tool to work out what's going on there.
One of the things that Tom helped put me onto in that thing is a very useful little tool. We can easily access it. It's called 5 Voices, a little booklet, but you can go online. And it just helps you to understand yourself better and understand that others are different from you.
Yeah.
And it's a very accessible form of some emotional intelligence.
And it's very biblical, isn't it? You know, think of yourself with sober judgment, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. This isn't something that's not.
So, this is not wacko stuff, and it's just, so light bulbs moments. So we use it as a staff team to deepen our emotional intelligence. So actually, although we had a staff team, we all we're all really different. And when you speak, that's why I hear you that way. And, so you mean, you hear me that way? I didn't mean that at all. Because you would, So that's true of the whole church. So there are really good tools. And your study, I mean, people could get that off you, couldn't they? Yeah.
In a minute, Ray, I'm going to ask you the women question. That's come to you. I just want to there's a bit of pushback, Michael, on your stuff about rotas. How does stuff get done? No one has the gift of putting out chairs, someone's asked. So does everyone actually end up sitting on the floor? How does stuff actually get done at FIEC? If you kind of sit a bit fast and loose to rota, it all sounds a bit, edgy, not having a rota. How does stuff actually get done?
Well, obviously, I'm being a bit provocative. You do have to have rotas or at least systems to get things accomplished. But I think the thing which I've come to see is that what I'm much more concerned about doing the work to create an empowered team. And this is risky, and I recognize that a lot of places that will take time to evolve and get to that or transform to that situation. But I would much rather have an empowered team that I knew was passionate and then say to them, this is what needs to be accomplished. Now, you tell me how you're going to do it. And so that the team itself has the passion, they determine how they set out the chairs. And they determine when they're going to do it. Because at that point, it's much more playing to what they find fulfillment, their joy, their satisfaction in, rather than merely something that's impersonal. And that takes a lot of work. You're going to have to continue investing into that. But that has an ability to replicate itself with new people. And I was talking with someone recently, the whole area of stewarding and showing people their seats. And they said to me the most amazing, incomprehensible statement I think I've ever heard. They said, I enjoy stewarding. And to me, I say, how could anyone enjoy stewarding? But they do. And what I would much rather do is to find 5 people that have a joy and passion for that and say, now you tell me how to do this and I'll equip you. Then 15 people on a rotor that are constantly coming to me, I can't do it this week. Can somebody else do it?
Does that mean at a certain level, you as a leader have to learn to sit loose to things that happen down the chain, so to speak, so that actually, if the chairs don't get put out, let's just push it a little bit. If the chairs don't get put out the way that you want them put out, you just got to learn to not be fussed by that.
There's obviously all kind of degrees within this, and there may have to be issues where we have to intervene. But I do think that if we want to multiply ministry, we have to let go of ministry to some degree. Because the more we hold to ourselves, we self-limit the ministry that God can do.
That's hard, right?
Within the church.
That's a hard thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that Michael and I have talked to this a lot, that if you want to, you can either hold on to power, and in the long term you will lose influence, or you give power away and you gain influence. So you give the power to the team. You guys figure it out. We've got to see 800 people in this hall. You guys figure out, you're good at this. We'll trust you. And then when they say, we've come across a problem, Ray, what do you think? That's influence. That's not power. Too many of us have inherited a command and control. This is how power works. We're in control. You do as you're told. Actually, churches that function like that won't function very well. You have to have a communal sense of we're doing this together.
Or I guess might reach a certain size and go no further.
Yeah, or yes, you'll plateau at a capacity
same kind of
level.
idea. Yeah.
And so in Acts 6, you guys, we set you apart. Are we all on in on this? And everybody goes, yeah, great idea, good. Okay, guys, we'll leave it with you. We're not going to tell you how to do it. We haven't done it very well. Actually, you're probably going to do it better than we can do it. So you give power away. And I think it's a really important thing to say. You asked a question about individuals. I think we all function with our gifts in community. So it's not, I've got a gift, get out of my way. It's we serve together. And it's like the we is how I know what gifts I've got, because basically it's your feedback that says you are blessing us through doing it this way. And so it's always in a community. So I think people function well in a community and where they want to do it better. And part of helping volunteers is creating that community sense that now in a big church, we might be the coffee brewers because we've got to brew coffee for 800 people. We might be the music team. But in a small church, we are the coffee brewers and the music team and the chair setters, but there is still that we, not I. And I think that's that genius of working together, which the Christian church should shine at, really.
And that resourcing of people to do their job takes quite more resource than you feel like it should if you're going to do it well. I mean, when you went as a church to 2 morning services, you exemplified how you empowered your teams to think through what it was going to mean for them and what more resources they might need and those sort of things. But that was far from a quick and easy thing. You took a long time doing that, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, yeah. So when we went to 2 services, the whole process took 18 months. And the different teams, they met many times. Not under our diktat, but like you go away and figure it out. What would it take for you to do 2 lots of kids' work? How many volunteers do you need? What resources? You go and figure it out. So in that sense, members get ownership by being involved at that level. And that's important in an independent church in particular, where the tendency as we get bigger is like, we're bosses, you're the workers. That'll kill.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move away from rotas, because I'm fighting the temptation very hard not to do the Christian rota joke. It's kind of, I just want to do it. It's like a default position. It's like Pavlov's dogs. So let's talk about women in leadership and how we encourage and appropriately empower women to take on leadership roles in the church, what that looks like. Ray, I said I would come back to you, so you kick us off with that.
Yeah, well, at one time, when I told you about the guy who worked in the ambulance service who went back into full-time work and left me on my own, so it was quite a large church by this time, probably 180, 200 people, and we wanted to see the church grow, and we and we actually, one of the biggest blockages is more and more pastoral time taken up, which essentially I need to do with my wife, because we were dealing with quite a lot of complex single mums, divorcees, widows, wives whose husbands weren't Christians, and we thought, what, if we could get that looked after by wise women, that would be terrific. And at one time, we employed me and 4 part-time women, and the church multiplied like mad. And it was a very exciting time to see that tremendous strength of brilliant networking, outward-focused community work. It was a very exciting time. The whole church was like, there is a massive underdeveloped resource here. And so we've had a very strong setting women free to help other women in the church do all that God wants them to achieve. So that has been very encouraging for us, and that was a very big step forward. We still have 4 or 5 women workers in the church. We have a larger male staff now because we're training and giving away church planters and so on. In terms of other things, well, there's loads of teams that women can lead. So our women lead all kinds of teams. We have older women training younger women. We have women leading women's home groups. We encourage our elders to talk a lot to their wives. I've met some churches where they'll say, "Oh no, I never tell anything to my wife about what we talk about." So what? Well, you should. You need her perspective. For goodness sake, come on. And we have meetings where we get together and listen. And often we encourage our wives, like, please, talk about this with the people you naturally connect to. Not so easy for me to go along and, in just the way it comes out. So that's been helpful for us. Churches will always vary on that continuum, if you like, from a elder-led church through to Priscilla and Aquila putting Apollos right, where it looks like Priscilla took the lead in a private conversation. There's that kind of continuum. And churches draw the line of where they would say, that's right before God, that's wise before God, that's not wise before. And in an FIC group, we have a statement on women's ministry, it's clear, but there's still tremendous freedom about what's wise in your own circumstances.
Thank you, that's very helpful, Ray. We've got about 10 minutes left. Can I just do some quick fire stuff? So it's not necessarily connected, but sort of jumping around things that people are asking, so it's quite nice to be able to talk to some of these situations. How do you organise pastoral oversight when the congregation becomes too big to notice? Too big to notice who's there from week to week. How would you organise pastoral oversight? What about?
Let me tell you what I've inherited in going to Beccles. That we have people divided up into home groups, and home group leaders have pastoral oversight of those people in their groups. At the moment, not everybody is assigned to a home group, and we also have a pastoral care team that takes particular responsibility for the people who are more needy, less able to get out on a Sunday, and that is, at the moment, we have people on that team who are just beyond exceptional in just visiting people, caring for people, and we meet kind of once a month-ish, and just kind of catch up on how we're doing. Is there anybody that needs a particular visit, any particular concerns? But there's just I've moved into a church where there's a culture of caring for people, but there's also structures in place. So pastoral care team, we had something similar at Dunstable, and home group leaders taking the first.
So it's culture and structure, not just one or the other.
So you never want to play organic versus organised. It's not either. So it's not like, well, if everybody
Ray,
looks...
can everything you say be reduced to 140 characters? It's wonderful. I love it.
So organic is, if everybody looked after everybody, we'll all be okay.
Yep.
No, we won't. There will be widows not getting fed. But some churches then go, oh, everything must be hyper-organised, you know. So you go, no, we want to both organic, caring, and organised structure. So Acts 2 and Acts 6 together bring us the organic and the organised. Very important. The other thing I would say is this little mantra: if you want to go large, you grow small. So it's right back down to.
That's a lesson 140 as well.
Yeah, look at that.
Tell us what that means.
So Jethro's insight: if you have several million people and you want to care for them, you break them down into groups of 10. You start with a group that's eyeball to eyeball. Everybody knows each other quite well, and they'll get cared for at that level. If it's too complicated for 10, send it up to 50, and so on. And in a sense, I've never met a large church. I've just met lots of groups of people who are part of a large church. You don't just find a big crowd anymore. You find care is given relationally. So actually, a large church will, if it wants to keep growing and caring, will put a lot of resources into its small groups. Because without that, the care won't happen for some people. It will for some, but others will get missed. So the small group structure, which Tom describes, is really important.
Okay, Michael, this is a good question for you, actually. Do we need to be stronger about or cultivate more the role of a good number two? So you've gone from Flitwick to Highfields, where you're working alongside Dave Gobbett. Do we need to value that kind of role more in churches, do you think? Are we any good at that?
Well, I think Dave's the one that's going to have to answer that question as to whether it's a value or not.
Okay.
You're going to say something cheeky.
Yeah. I think as a church grows, you need a diversity and unity. And part of the diversity is you will need to grow a team of those who are set aside for ministry, who are not identical, who have different strengths. One of the important things you'll have to do is to decide what are you weak at and find somebody who's good at that and ask them to come alongside you so they can counterbalance you. And I think, again, if we hold ministry to ourselves, we limit it. If we learn to become diverse and have other people that are empowered with their strengths, we actually multiply ministry far more than we could ever imagine. So if a number two can do that, that's brilliant. But I think you have to take each situation by its own.
Okay, fair enough. Let's just think about leaderships and staff and how they work together. So thinking of elders really and staff. You've all been in churches which have had different levels, elders and staff. That's sometimes a tension, isn't it, Ray, in terms of, you've got the staff are there, they're paid, they're there full-time, they're almost effectively doing the work of elders, they're not always elders themselves. How do you manage that tension between having full-time staff and having an eldership which has authority or has responsibility for leading in the church?
Yeah, one of the challenges, when you're in a small church, everybody knows everything. In a medium-sized church, your core people know everything. In a very large church, you get to understand nobody knows everything. And also, the elders of a very large church they'll say, of course we don't know what's going on. We're only elders, we don't know what's going on. We've trusted other people. It's as you grow through where you go from we know everything to we don't know everything. So you've got to train people to give power decisions away. And that has to start much earlier than you think it does. You will never get a larger church unless you learn that way early on. So you have to train elders. Look, you've got to trust the staff. You've got to trust the team, that team of volunteers. You've got to learn to trust them, that you've given them the sort of rough orbit of what they want to achieve. But after that, trust that God has placed those people in that place for that reason. Now, you need careful oversight, but it's not controlling oversight. It's more like encouraging oversight, really. My experience has been if you trust people and encourage them, they go much, much further than if you try to control them and define them all the time. They may not necessarily go in the direction, they may not, it's a bit open-ended, but
there's a risk involved.
It's a risk involved, but you're tapping into what the Holy Spirit's doing in their lives, not dictating to the Holy Spirit what he must do in their lives. And that's true of staff. So elders have learned to step back a little bit and say, we've got to learn to trust these people. Otherwise, the decision-making is far too cumbersome to react. So 2 days before we came away, just 48 hours before a massive Remembrance Sunday, I had a phone call from the hall we hire saying there are 9 travellers' caravans and their associated vehicles in the car park. There is no space in the car park. There's about 500 people coming. And I was like, oh, right. Well, we had to trust the people who were going to sort that problem out. We prayed a lot about it, but we trust you to sort this out. And in the goodness of God, it was all sorted. That was fine. You just have to learn to do that.
How do you, I think this is quite an interesting question. How do you do that with people who you've trusted but want to overshare? So you can get people, can't you, in the church who are very competent and able, have the right spirit, but either for validation or because they're a little bit unsure, they want to tell you everything they're doing. So the car parking thing, for example, you might get someone who says, right, I've got these ideas, let me take them back to Ray and he can help me decide which one. How do you deal with someone who has got that sort of upward eagerness, as well as your eagerness about wanting to delegate downwards?
Tom, what do you think about that? You've lived in that world a bit, where you've had to eager beavers. I've done a lot, yeah. You thought about that?
I don't know. To some extent, I'd say, well, what do you think? And I'd push them to say, go on, if you had to make a choice. I think I'd just do it conversationally and relationally. And if there is it's trying to track as well, is that if this is a habitual problem, it might be the case of saying, actually, we need to sit down and let's have a coffee. Can we just, or actually using the annual review or something like that with someone, or doing something where you just sit down with them and you talk about a habit. But I think if it was just one situation, I think I'd say, well, come on, what are your options? Tell me what are your options, and what do you think you'd go for if you had to make a choice without me telling you? But
There's a very helpful book, John Maxwell's 360-degree leadership, where he talks about leading north, which is where you lead up. And actually, you have to do a lot of training how to lead up well. So leaders assume that you lead south. You lead people who are following you, and that's true, and you have to train those skills in your leaders of 10s and so on. And you lead sideways, we better tell you that, we've just booked that room that you used to use, that thing. But most of his book is about how to lead up well. And most of us don't think about how important it is to lead up well. So actually, when you lead up, most of the time you need to say, we had a problem with travellers, Ray, but it's solved. Not, we've got a problem with travellers, Ray, what are you going to do about it? I've got many other things to do at the time. So actually part of our training is discussing together how can we all of us lead up well so that we don't get this every time there's a problem, I'll phone whoever. Otherwise, it collapses. So if I had a phone call from somebody saying, Ray, you really need to know this, I don't know what to do about it, I know, okay, this is really serious, it needs me. But that takes time, and none of us are good at that. It just doesn't come naturally. So begin to think, how can I lead up well is a
Thank
skill,
you,
yeah.
Ray. We're out of time. Thank you very much for contributions. We really appreciate it. It seems to me that one of the common themes that's coming through is so much of good leadership is being able to think about ourselves well with that sober judgment, to understand our capabilities, to understand where we do need to grow and develop, to understand our limits, to be able to say to other people, no, you take this on and you take that on. So we ought to be praying really at the end, not just for our churches, but for ourselves as leaders. But I think we would have that sober judgment that the Bible encourages us to have so that we might be good